President Donald Trump sitting down with CNBC's own Joe Kernan on Squawk Box, indicating that he is ready to place tariffs on $505 billion worth of Chinese goods imported to the United States, should the need arise. Listen.
Will you ever get to 500, though?
I'm ready to go to 500.
We've got with the midterms on the horizon. What if the stock market were to go down?
I actually think that's, if it does, it does. Look, I'm not doing this for
20%?
Politics. I'm doing this to do the right thing for our country. We have been ripped off by China for a long time. And I told that to President Xi. And it's very interesting because I actually asked him the question. So we're down 507 recently. We're down $507 billion in trade deficits. How did it happen? And they told me nobody ever complained.
Here with us to talk about this is visiting fellow at the Independent Women's Forum and senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union, Mattie Duppler, and David Dollar, senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Good afternoon to you both. Mattie, if I start with you, do you think we have fully crossed into a trade war now, given this elevated rhetoric today?
I don't care what you call it, a war, a skirmish, a conflict, whatever it is, it's confusing and it's going to have an impact on consumers here in the United States. Now, I think it's funny that the president yesterday said, no one ever complained. That's why we're pursuing these trade efforts now. The reason we're taking shots at China is because we need to actually get at the issues that he has been complaining about for years and years and years. The one thing the president has been very consistent about is he thinks that the United States is being taken advantage of by other countries who have higher exports than we do import into their country. Now, I would argue that not only is the trade deficit a distraction from the full picture of the economy, but it also begs the question here when we're talking with the president, listening to what he said yesterday with Joe Kernan, for the first time, he really admitted here that the cost of the trade war is an impact on the economy. He said the stock market could be higher if he hadn't initiated these actions against China and the EU, but he thinks that this is a battle worth having. I would argue that it is not, but I do hope that actually exerts some political pressure and allows the president an opportunity. Earlier you were talking before about what is the end game when it comes to the administration's tariffs and trade efforts. Perhaps this is the way the president will get himself out of the tariff skirmish that he's gotten himself into by talking about the effect that it's had on the American economy. My hope is that he'll be able to eventually diminish some of the pressures that have been ratcheted up here.
David, the reason other countries hadn't complained before about the trade deficit is because the trade deficit is not a reflection at all about how we are treated fairly or unfairly on trade. I mean, you can't find an economist in the mainstream that will tell you that. Separately, though, by these interviews and the tweets, we're getting more and more from the president on trade, on how he views this whole strategy. Do you have a clear picture about what he's aiming for and how it plays out from here?
I think the president is really digging himself into a hole with this focus on the balance and bilateral deficits. He was reeling off quotes about bilateral deficits this morning. European Union, Mexico, China. All of those bilateral deficits are going up this year because of his policies. He cut taxes, and that's stimulating consumption, and the dollar's rising, and the U.S. trade deficit with each of these different partners is going up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, given the macroeconomic situation. But I think that's just the wrong way to prosecute the trade war. Now, we do have legitimate trade issues with China, particularly market access in some specific areas and intellectual property rights protection. So it makes more sense to focus in on the real distortions. And it also makes sense to work with Europe and Japan and other partners because we all have similar concerns with China. But the president is antagonizing all the different trade partners, throwing them all in together into the same pool. And that's going to make it very hard to take on the real problems in China.
David, we had Larry Kudlow on our air earlier this week, and he said that President Xi just was not engaging with these talks. He wasn't willing to move even an inch back in the direction that President Trump would like him. Given that, if that is really the case, surely the president has no choice but to elevate matters.
Well, the Chinese perspective is that twice they think they had an agreement, once when Mnuchin was in Beijing and once when their envoy Liu He was in Washington. They thought they had an agreement, and then the president walked away from it. So the Chinese perspective now is that you can't negotiate with cabinet-level officials. They don't really have discretion. So you have to wait till you get Xi Jinping and Trump sitting down together. That's probably not going to happen until Buenos Aires on December 1st, when the G20 Leaders Summit is held, unless they get some kind of special meeting. I think the Chinese are reconciled to this playing out during 2018. They're focused on what domestic policies can address their growth issues while they take this so far relatively small hit. But I think the Chinese really don't see any prospect for negotiating in the near term.
Maddie, your take on that particular topic. Is there any grounds here for what the president is doing, in your view, in terms of escalating things with the Chinese? Clearly,
Sorry, Wilfred. Yeah, again, the question is, what is the objective of the administration here? The president talks a lot about the trade deficit. You hear him throw out a lot of numbers in that interview yesterday with Joe Kernan. But his administration talks a lot about the different problems we have with Chinese actors, with whether it's market access, tech transfers, IP protection, all of the problems that are serious problems when it comes to playing with China on a global scale. Those are the issues that really need to be addressed by our trade policy. Tariffs don't do that. Tariffs are a tax on American consumers that ultimately increase prices here, and as was discussed before, do very little to influence behavior abroad.
David, it's Evan Newmark. Do you think deep down that Donald Trump believes that trade really is a zero-sum game? And if that's the case, why would anybody negotiate with him?
No, I think you're right. I think there is evidence he really thinks it's zero sum. And that's why it's interesting that as he's done these measures, even countries that are very close allies of the United States, like European Union, Canada, Mexico, everyone is basically retaliating. And I think that's the book in this negotiating business. If a big country like the U.S. punches you in the nose, you've got to punch them back. Otherwise, they're going to keep coming with more and more requests. So I think this was predictable, that as the U.S. went down this protectionist road, that all of these different partners were going to be hitting back. And then it's hard to create an environment for negotiation. Now, I don't think we should be too pessimistic. What they've done so far is modest in scale. Now they're talking about some larger things. The auto tariffs would be the most serious. This is going to start to have an effect on the U.S. economy. I think at least there's a pretty good probability that after the midterm elections, this will be having more effect on the economy. The incentives will change, and the U.S. will want to go out to a country like China, try to negotiate a deal. The Chinese are willing to buy more of different products. They're gradually opening up more markets. So I think they feel that their offer is pretty clear. Maybe it can be sweetened a little bit. At some point, it's probably in the U.S. interest to just take the deal.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much, David Dollar and Maddie Duppler.
Great name, David.